الناس حبك بيض الله قلبك بيض الله قلبك كن سموحا لخصمك ألقى خصمك أحبك بيض الله قلبك بيض الله قلبك واحتفل بالمودة إنما
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Ahlan wa sahlan wa marhaban bikum. Welcome to the Moulana Sulaimaan Ravat show here on ITV. In today's show, we're going to discuss a very important topic, and a topic that we hope, inshallah, will be some help to most couples out there. And this topic we're going to discuss tonight is conflict management in marriage. And I'm delighted to be joined in studio by Moulana Sulaimaan Ravat, who will unpack this topic more for us. Moulana, assalamu alaikum. Welcome to the show.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh to you, Muhammad, and to the viewers of ITV and this particular program.
Moulana, it's nice having you once again on the other side of the table. I think it's a really important topic and something that inshallah could help some people in their marriages.
Yeah, as we know, marriage is a very sacred institution in Islam. Marriage is the cornerstone of a prosperous community. You need a functional marriage to have a functional family, to have a functional community. And we know that today increasingly marriages are coming under pressure, they're coming under strain. So there's conflict. And conflict is to be expected. Turbulence in marriage is to be expected. It's like, when you take a flight, you can be on the A380, you can be on the most sophisticated aircraft, but turbulence is unavoidable. And when you have two human beings sharing their lives in such an intimate way, sharing a space, sharing a family, sharing many things, as humans, we are different in our temperaments, in our habits, in our preferences, in our way of thinking, in our approach, in our attitude. So there's bound to be, no matter how in love you are, no matter how compatible you may be, then too, there's bound to be some turbulence, bound to be some issue, some conflict from time to time. So I think from the onset we must understand that this romantic notion of a perfect marriage is just a fairy tale, really. When we say a perfect marriage, then we mean a marriage wherein you are happy, notwithstanding the challenges and notwithstanding the ups and downs and notwithstanding the turbulences and the conflicts. But there can be no perfect marriage in the sense that there's absolutely no problems, no issues, no ups and downs. That is just not realistic. In Jannah, yes, inshallah, you will have such a marriage. So the idea here is to discuss how to minimize and how to mitigate the conflict within marriage. Because whilst on the one hand it is unavoidable, it's natural, it will happen from time to time, you don't want it happening all the time. Because if you have a flight which is full of turbulence, then it's not going to be a flight that you are going to enjoy, and it can even at some point become dangerous. So that's the core of this particular discussion, and I think it's a relevant discussion because people are increasingly having challenges in their marriages, and the challenges are changing. They're different. Modern lifestyle has put different kinds of pressure on marriage. And every now and again, we have to visit the topic of marriage, as I say, because from time immemorial until the day of Qiyamah, it remains a sacred institution. It started in Jannah. It will continue in Jannah. And if you want a functional society, you want a functional and a united and a prosperous ummah, then the cornerstone, the founding block is a solid marriage.
Moulana, you mentioned something important, managing the conflict. So we've come to the realization there will be conflict. So how important is it to manage this conflict in a way according to the Quran and Sunnah?
Well, let's look at three aspects first, right? Three factors that will help us to navigate around conflict in marriage. A lot, and we'll talk about this later, a lot has to do with your own emotional intelligence, your own character development, making certain adjustments, etc. But three, I would say, pivots when it comes to mitigating, minimizing conflict in marriage. The first would be taqwa. Now, many times we hear the scholars say, and even at the time of the solemnizing of the marriage, that if you look at all the verses, يا أيها الناس اتقوا ربكم يا أيها الذين آمنوا اتقوا الله وقولوا قولا سديدا يا أيها الذين آمنوا اتقوا الله حق تقاته. None of the verses of nikah are read in the khutbah of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam at the time of nikah, but all the verses of taqwa. Why? Because marriage is a very private affair and it's a very intimate affair. And in most instances, only husband and wife know what's happening in the marriage. Many times you'll see after the marriage collapsed, even the parents of the respective spouses will say, we never knew what was happening. We never knew they had these issues. So by emphasizing taqwa, Allah is highlighting to us that, listen, O husband, O wife, you are answerable ultimately to Allah in terms of how you fulfill your obligations towards your spouse and how you handle yourself within that marriage. So you may sometimes have a spouse that is a bit meek, that cannot stand up for himself or herself. And you may think, well, I've got a free ride here, I can do whatever I want. You may have a spouse who is supremely tolerant. But Allah is warning us repeatedly that, look, whatever happens in that marriage, maybe only in this world the two of you would know, but Allah always knows. And ultimately, as a husband, you have to stand before Allah, and as a wife, you have to stand before Allah, and you have to account for what you had to do and for the role that you had to play. So once you have that consciousness, then automatically it helps you in terms of managing your marriage and taking care of your side of it. The second aspect of taqwa is that the more you are conscious of Allah and the more you are obedient to Allah, the more Allah would put barakah in your marriage. There's a hadith of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam that when you see this turbulence in your relationships, then it is time for you to check the state of your relationship with Allah. Because when you become disobedient to Allah, Allah withdraws His mercies, His blessings. And your various relationships are then affected with your siblings, your parents, your employees, your employer. But the first and the most impacted relationship is your marriage, because it's the most intimate. So even though you may be married for a long time, you may be very much in love, but when there's no help, there's no blessings from Allah, then there's going to be more problems than usual. So that's why taqwa is a very important factor in terms of mitigating conflict in marriage and limiting conflict in marriage. And the third is dua. This is a very neglected aspect when it comes to marriage. We normally think that you only lift your hands now when the marriage has hit the rocks. But from a young age, we need to be teaching our children to make dua for a good spouse, for a prosperous marriage, for pious offspring. And we see the Quran is replete with such examples. The famous verse of the 19th juz, رَبَّنَا هَبْ لَنَا مِنْ أَزْوَاجِنَا وَذُرِّيَّاتِنَا قُرَّةَ أَعْيُنٍ. Oh Allah, grant us such children and such spouses who will be the delight of our eyes, who will be the coolness of our eyes, both in this world as well as in the hereafter. So, dua before marriage, dua at the time of marriage, and dua every day after marriage. How many of us actually daily make dua that, oh Allah, grant me more happiness in my marriage, grant me the ability to be a better husband, to be a better wife, grant me the ability to increase in my love and my muhabbat. So these three things, taqwa, tolerance and dua, I think these are three pivots when it comes to helping a person mitigate conflict within marriage and navigate around conflict in marriage.
So now we know how we're going to mitigate it. Now, how do we go on managing the conflict? Because, as we said, conflict will happen in a marriage. Now, managing the conflict, because humans have a nature that when they're angry, they can say things that they don't mean. They say things in anger. So how important is it to manage the conflict properly and in an Islamic way?
Well, I think there are a few things. Number one is that you need to have the tools to be able to manage conflict. In marriage in particular and life in general. I think today, if you look at young boys and girls, many of them struggle in marriage, they struggle with parenting, they struggle in interpersonal relationships, not because they are bad people or not because they are impious per se, that they have no consciousness of what is right and wrong, simply because they are not adequately equipped with the tools. There isn't an education in the school of life that needs to take place as to how to be a husband, how to be a wife, when a dispute arises, when an issue arises, how to manage it. Now, where will you learn that? You see, today we send our children to school and we teach them how to read, write and count, and that's important. We send them to madrasa, they learn how to read Quran and make wudu and perform salam. But how many of us from a young age, when they enter the teenage phase, start giving them books on marriage? What are the responsibilities of the husband and the wife? When issues arise, how do you deal with issues? What are the preventative measures? How do you, what are the qualities that you require to be able to manage it? So theoretically, there's no education, right? Maybe as a gift at the time of nikah, now you'll give them a book on marriage, gift to husband and wife.
Kitabun Nikah.
Kitabun Nikah. So they maybe start glancing through it, at the 11th hour, or they perhaps even just start reading it after marriage. It's better late than never, but that's not the appropriate way. That's the theory. But more important than the theory is the practical aspect of it. Today, the big problem is that youngsters don't spend enough time in the company of elders. Now, it's normal that you would gravitate towards people of your own category. You go to any function, you see people of the same family sitting together. You see all the Moulana sitting together. You see all the youngsters sitting together. You go with your children for holiday, but they want to cut a line and be with people, with their own age group. That's natural. And to some extent, you have to allow for that. Children can't always be with adults. They want to do things with people or children of their own age. But as parents, we need to impose that to some extent, that girl must spend time with her mother. and see how does her mother deal with the man who comes home frustrated. He's had a bad day at the office. The boy must spend time with his father. How does the father deal with the fact that he's had a long day at the office, he comes home, he just walks through the door. The domestic burnt my cloak. Your daughter is not listening to me. The food burnt. How does he deal with that? When there's an issue, when there's a disagreement between husband and wife, how did the husband deal with it? How did the wife deal with it? It's only when you spend time in the company of elders, not only your own parents, but even your uncles and your aunties, that is when you will learn how to manage these things. So the theory, we need to be getting our children to read. Many times we pull them out of maktab or madrasa before they reach the higher end of the high school years, because in the early years they can't grasp concepts. So they're just memorizing duas and surahs and that kind of thing. But later years, that's when they're teaching them about nikah and these quality traits that they require for life in general and marriage in particular. That's the time we pull them out. So they go into a marriage with all sincerity, but they don't have the tools. Theoretically, know in terms of what they've observed of their own parents or the elders in their society and community. So they haven't absorbed. Many times, at that age, they won't realize it. It's like boring. Why must I be with the older people? But later on in life, when you find yourself in similar situations, that's when you reflect, and that's when at that time it gives you inspiration. My dad used to handle it this way. My mom used to handle it this way, and this is. So I think that's a starting point in terms of how to manage it.
One of the really important points. I think we're going to take a short break now. When we come back, we can discuss some of the causes of conflict in marriage. We're taking a short break now. Stay tuned. Welcome back. Before the break, we were discussing mitigating and managing conflict in a marriage. Moulana is still with us in the studio. Moulana, you want to add a bit more on managing the conflict in the marriage?
Yeah, look, before the break, we spoke about taqwa, right? We spoke about dua. I think tolerance is also a key aspect. And if you don't have tolerance, you're not going to be able to manage conflict. There's a lot of things that you need to tolerate. When Nabi sallallahu alayhi wasallam saw one sahabi, it was a lengthy incident, but he told him that Allah loves two qualities in you. Al-hilm wal-anat. The first is that you are a very tolerant person. So tolerance is something which is a sign of strength. It's not a sign of weakness. And many times in marriage, we tend to think, well, if I tolerate, it means I'm being taken advantage of. Not necessarily. There's no relationship wherein everything is going to go your way. And if there's any relationship for which you have to make some sacrifices, especially of the ego, then it's marriage, because it's worthwhile at the end of the day. It's a person that you love the most, it's the person that you depend the most on. If there's no tolerance, you're going to struggle in terms of managing conflict, because managing conflict doesn't mean that you sit down and say, okay, you're wrong, I'm right. Let's just agree on that. That's not how you manage conflict. There's a lot more give than there is going to be take. So each spouse within a marriage needs to work on their levels of tolerance. And I also explained, one factor in terms of managing it that give people the tools to manage it via the education, theoretically as well as practically. Now, if we look at some of the causes then, right, I would think that there could be many, but some that we could touch on. What leads to conflict within marriage? Because if you can identify a cause, you can either prevent it, or even if it does arise, then it's easier to manage it if you understand where it is rooted. The first is that in many marriages, I don't think there's an adjustment process, or adjustment period rather. What happens is that many people go into marriage somewhat negative. They look at the high rate of divorce and they hear the horror stories of that cousin or that neighbor. So both husband and wife come into a marriage wanting to stamp their authority very early on, and wanting to draw the line in the sand very early on. So the husband wants to show up front in the marriage that, you know what, I'm the boss. And the wife wants to show, I'm not going to be bullied. I'm not a girl from yesteryear who will be submissive to husband and that kind of thing. Now, the normal example that I give you, Mohammed, is that if you go to a shoe shop and you say, right, I wear a size 10 and you buy a size 10 shoe, it's your size. But there's going to be an adjustment period, because every size 10 foot doesn't have exactly the same features and contours. So the first few weeks when you wear that shoe, you may feel some pain, because now that shoe has to mold itself according to the unique features of your foot, even though it's the same size. So when you look for a spouse, you look for a spouse who is very compatible to you in terms of background, in terms of interest, in terms of outlook in life, etc. But then too, there has to be an adjustment period. Even if you marry your own cousin, even if you grew up in the same house, I mean, if two brothers were living in the same house and the one brother's son gets married to the other brother's daughter, now you can't get closer than that. But then too, there has to be an adjustment. Why? Because you were living as individuals. Now you make an adjustment to your routine, you make an adjustment to your itinerary. It's no longer about me, it's about us. It's no longer what I want, it's about what we want. It's not like what I need, it's what we need. That's why many marriages crumble these days within the first year. Because I don't think the spouses allow each other the space to adjust. They want the maximum, they want the ultimate too quickly. They're not allowing for that adjustment period. Then the third thing is that the tongue, you can look at it as a cause of conflict in marriage, and you can also look at it as a managing factor. That if you want to manage conflict in marriage, you need to regulate how you use your tongue. Because a lot of things are said unnecessarily. A lot of things are said which are not meant. And then as a result, you have unnecessary conflict. And sometimes when you have conflict is exacerbated by what you say at the time of conflict. That's why it is always a good idea to keep quiet until both parties have cooled down somewhat. You never try and resolve a conflict where tempers are flaring and when emotions are high, because you're going to say things which are going to make the situation worse. And we know Nabi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam had said, أَكْثَرُ خَطَايَا ibn Adam fi lisani. The majority of the sins of the son of Adam relates to what the tongue does. The tongue, one movement of the tongue and you solemnize the marriage. نَكَحْتُهَا وَقَبِلْتُهَا. One movement of the tongue and you break the marriage after 30, 40 years of companionship, after children and grandchildren. That's how powerful the tongue is. And research has shown that many times people, victims of verbal abuse, find it more difficult to recover than even victims of physical and at times even sexual abuse. Because just to get those words that are ringing and echoing in your head as to what was said to you is very difficult. As much as you try, as much as you forgive, you struggle to forget. So to prevent conflict or to mitigate conflict and also to manage conflict, you have to regulate your usage of the tongue. Now these things don't happen overnight. And I also always say that you have to train your children because these are life skills. It has an impact on marriage. It also impacts right through. And even as adults, we need to be constantly working on it. Because it's like, you call your son the day before he gets married and says, okay, my son, listen now. All this moving around with your friends and all this partying and all of that must come to an end. Now you're married. But for 20 years, that's the only lifestyle he knew. Now he'll get married. There'll be a romantic phase of 3 months. And then he goes back to his old habits. Your daughter was never shadowing her mother. She was throwing tantrums in her house. You were allowing it to do it. Now you're saying, okay, my daughter, you're going to somebody else's house. You must carry yourself with dignity. Don't throw tantrums. Don't throw your toys out of the cot when it doesn't go your way. It's not going to happen because there wasn't that training in that particular mode. Now you're giving nasiha at a time when habits have already set in. Fine. I mean, people can still change, but very rarely do they do. And therefore, when it comes also to the tongue, from a young age, we need to teach people to control their tongue, not to speak out of turn, not to speak impulsively, not to speak when angry. Another cause of conflict in marriage is a lack of effort, where people take things for granted. And as you go into marriage, 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, this is where this factor plays a part. Where, I always say that marriage is like a garden. If you're a gardener, if you're a passionate gardener, you can't say, well, for 6 weeks I worked in my garden. Now the flowers are blooming. I'm looking at brilliant colors, nice smells. For the next 6 months, I can leave it. Because after 6 months, there'll be weeds all over the show. Those flowers will be dying. If you want a flourishing garden, right? If you want a beautiful garden, you have to work at it all the time. You have to work at it all the time. And marriage is like that. You cannot sit back. Even if you're happy, even if someone is watching the program and saying, well, I don't make much effort in my marriage, but I'm relatively happy. You could be much happier if you were making effort. Marriage is constant effort. Now, none of us say, well, why must I make effort every day for money? We understand the value of money. The older we get, the harder we work, right? And we lament that, look at these young people, they're so lazy, they don't know what's an honest day's work. Why is it that marriage, which is such a reservoir of happiness, such a reservoir of stability in your life, such a cornerstone of prosperity and success, not only for the individuals, but the family unit and the community and the ummah, why is it that we don't put effort? Why is it that we're not reading? We're not upskilling ourselves. We're not listening. We're not thinking, how can I improve my marriage? What are the problems? How can I make my marriage better? And then lastly, perhaps in terms of causes that we can talk about is the in-law factor. Now, I'm just kind of mentioning 1 or 2 points under each one of these subheadings, if you like, because each one of these subheadings can become an independent topic on its own. I mean, communication is such an important factor when it comes to minimizing conflict in marriage and managing conflict, but that is also a discussion on its own, perhaps one will have in the future. The in-laws factor is an independent discussion, but I'll just say this much, that I find that people are on one of two extremes. You have those who enter into a marriage already assuming the mother-in-law to be a monster. And then you have those who enter into a marriage thinking, no, I will treat my mother-in-law like my mother and she will treat me like her daughter. It'll never happen, right? Even if you live with your mother-in-law and your sister-in-law is living in another side of the planet, her daughter will always be her daughter. Understand that, you know, you got to make your expectations. Your expectations have to be realistic. Don't try and be her daughter. You can try and do similar things. So then you otherwise will be disappointed. Your children will never be good enough, and then her children are saints. She can't help you, but she can cook because her daughter is going for Umrah and send all the pots over. So to avoid all of that, avoid one of the two extremes. I always say also that as far as possible, try and have separate quarters. In the old days, it may have worked to some extent where it's absolutely necessary, perhaps understood, but and women must be given their space. So even if you're the only son and you're looking after your mother, your father is passed on and your parents are elderly, your wife must have a space. She must have a space within which she is the queen, she calls the shots, she does what she needs to do too. So, you know, Islam is about balance. Islam doesn't say that because Jannah is under your mother's feet, your mother is always right and your wife is always wrong. On the other hand, Islam doesn't say that because you brought somebody else's daughter into your home, that she'll always be right and your mother is wrong. You have to be a buffer. When I got married, one of my ustads told me, you have to be like a sponge. You have to absorb from both sides. And it's better for you to absorb because the mother will forgive her son much more easily than she will forgive her daughter-in-law. And the wife will forgive her husband much more easily than she will forgive her mother-in-law. So you need very emotionally intelligent men to be able to deal with that dynamic. Sometimes you also have in-laws from the husband's perspective. We always say to the in-laws, the helping hand, not the imposing hand. Help them, but don't impose on the young couple. Give them the space. Allow them to be the parents of their own children. Allow them to live their own lives. In the end, Mohammed, I think the most important factor when it comes to managing conflict and preventing conflict and looking at some of the causes is we have unrealistic expectations in marriage. Too much of watching of Bold and Beautiful and Days of Our Lives and reading Mills and Boon's books and watching all these movies that have this, the lady gets a bit of a flu and the man takes off from work for the day. She slips and sprains her ankle and he spends three days with her, nursing her and romancing her. It doesn't happen in real life. And we don't realize, but subconsciously these things settle. And when you have unrealistic expectations, sometimes the most educated and the most professional and the most intelligent and the most knowledgeable of people, they go into marriages with too many romantic notions. And marriage normalizes. You know, everything can't be about romance. Everything can't be about chocolates and roses and eat outs and holding hands and lovey-dovey. There is an element of that. You know, we mustn't go to the other extreme where we totally suck it out of the marriage. But this hard life, you know, you come home tired, your wife has got her chores, she's got her responsibilities. Many couples, both spouses are working. So your expectations in marriage must be realistic. Don't over-romanticize it and don't have so high expectations that you are constantly disappointed. And don't always look at those who have something that you feel you don't have, because the grass is not always greener on the other side. Appreciate the positive that you have. Many times we have this problem. A lot of conflict in marriage is because you're looking at what you assume somebody else has. And then you make it an issue in your marriage, but then when you realize it was never really an issue because that person never really had what you assumed that they had. So in a nutshell, I think those are some of the issues that we must look at when we talk about what causes conflict in marriage and how we need to manage conflict within marriage.
I think very important, and I think what you mentioned is very, very important, is having balance and being realistic in your marriage. We're going to take a short break now. Stay tuned. Assalamu alaikum, welcome back. Before the break, we were discussing the causes of conflict in marriage. In this segment, we'd like to discuss how to resolve some of these causes and some of the conflicts in the marriage. Moulana is back with us in the studio. Moulana, I think it's a really important topic, and some of the points you brought about are really, really important, and inshallah, people will take some heed of it, and it can make some kind of a difference in their lives and in the lives of their children going forward. So we spoke about managing conflict, the causes of conflict, but I think most importantly is how do we resolve conflict? Because without the resolution, marriages are breaking left, right, and center everywhere you look. I mean, you're seeing people being married for 1, 2, or 3 weeks and the marriage is falling apart. And I think it's also a lack of education from the young bride and groom side, not getting the education. But I think it's important to know how to resolve conflict.
You know, I think A mistake that many people make in their marriages is that when they have an issue, they go too early to outside parties for help. And that is not necessarily a good thing. That is not supposed to be your first step. Even if that outside party is your wife, your father or your mother or your brother or somebody very close to you, you need to have a mechanism. You need to design a mechanism as a couple where both parties are then equally able to deal with conflict, to express themselves within the confines of the marriage. Now, I mentioned earlier on that you cannot do something like this when you're angry. You cannot do something like this when you're emotional. You need to say, okay, if you feel strongly about something, then we need to take time out. Then we need to go somewhere and we sit in privacy where we are both calm. Each person is given an adequate amount of time to speak. There's no interjection. I would say, and some people would scoff at this, that even have like an agenda, even if you don't have a formal agenda, but say, right, we are sitting here to talk about our dispute over finances, for example. Why? Otherwise, all the baggage from the time of Adam alayhi salam comes out. And each person now is trying to win an argument. They're not trying to resolve an issue. They're trying to triumph. The ego is trying to triumph rather than, it's about who's right rather than what's right. And that's where it becomes complicated in marriage. So you need to be calm, you need to be sober, and you need to say, we're discussing this issue and this issue only. Any other issue, we'll look at it some other time. So there needs to be a structured mechanism within marriage where both husband and wife feel they have an equal say. And then you look at each other, make eye contact. Right? Hold hands if you have to. Express your love for each other up front. So both parties feel that, okay, now we are calm. We remind ourselves why we're doing this, because we love each other, because our marriage is so important to us. What's the issue? Okay, this is the particular issue. You have your say, I have my say, you have your say, I have my say. We agree on a way forward, and write it if you have to. So that later on then no one spouse says that it was like this or it was like that. And I think in more instances than not, if you take this very constructive, very mature approach, if you do it in the right way, at the right time, in the right place, you can overcome most conflicts in your marriage. The second thing also you need to understand is that you don't need to make an issue over everything that you're not happy with. You see, I normally give this example, Mohammed, of the fishermen. These professional fishermen who are fishing in a competition, right? They know what the prize is. The prize is going to be for that guy who catches the big fish who weighs so much on the scales. So when they find a fish biting, and because they're experts, they can feel that this is a small fish. They don't waste time reeling it in, taking it off the hook, putting on a new hook, recasting. They just snip the line and they recast because they feel it's a small fish. Let it go, right? We want that big fish. In life, you cannot be having a meeting with your spouse every day. Okay, today I wasn't happy with this, tomorrow I wasn't. No, a lot of the small fish, you just have to let it slide. You have to let it slide. That's life. Because this world is not a perfect place. In Jannah is a perfect place. We are not perfect people. We are interactive people and we have to tolerate. That's why I spoke about tolerance a little. That which is really bugging you, that which is really irking you, that which is perhaps happening on a repetitive basis, then you say, right, okay, now we sit down and we talk. We don't quarrel. When you see that your spouse is argumentative, your spouse is hyper emotional, then that's the time to keep quiet, because that's not the time to resolve anything. That's not the time to try and explain your perspective. The intention is important. It has to be about love triumphing over pride. Many marriages have broken because of pride. The issue was minuscule, but because each party didn't want to back down, no, I have to be right, I have to prove myself right. Ridiculous things were said, hurtful things were said, accusations are thrown around. You also have to be humble enough to be able to admit when you are wrong. So you may think, you may start off thinking you are right, but you have to listen, you have to enter into that discussion with your spouse with an open mind. The great jurists used to say, we believe our opinion is right with the possibility of being wrong. And we believe that the opposite party's opinion is wrong with the possibility of being right. And that's a wonderful principle with which to engage with your spouse. If you believe from the onset, no, I'm right, there's no other way, then what's the point of engaging and trying to resolve the conflict? We have to be humble enough, and no matter who we are, to be able to say, I may be wrong. Let me listen to this person. Even if I'm right, let me try and understand why my spouse feels this way or why my spouse acts in this particular in this particular way. And an important point here we need to understand is that when you listen to each other, as you go through your marriage and issues arise and conflict arise, you will start to gauge and you will start to realize what is the temperament of your spouse. And rather than challenging the temperament of your spouse, try your best to conform to the temperament of your spouse, the habits of your spouse, the preferences of your spouse. This is part of the sunnah of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. When the Nabi of Allah was sitting and relaxing and his shin was exposed, Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu walked in, he didn't do anything. Umar radiallahu anhu walked in, he didn't do anything. But when Uthman radiallahu anhu walked in, he immediately first covered his shin, then allowed him to walk in. And when Aisha radiallahu anha asked, he said, I know Uthman is very shy by nature, I didn't want to inconvenience him. The Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam was not doing anything wrong. Had he remained sitting as he was, Uthman radiallahu anhu would not have been objected. Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam was senior. But he did not want to cause any inconvenience to the preferences, to the natural temperament of Uthman radiallahu anhu. Right, that in a dream also, when he saw the palace of Umar radiallahu anhu in Jannah, he said, I did not go in because I know Umar is a very private person. And Umar radiallahu anhu said, it would have been an honor for me, Ya Rasulullah. I said, no, but I know you're a private person. So if your wife wants the washing in the washing basket, then if you may feel, hey, what, it's my house, it's my washing. Nobody's coming to give me a scorecard to see whether it's in that basket or not. But if that's her preference, then abide by that preference. What's it going to cost you? If your husband, has a particular temperament, he doesn't want you to bang his car door closed. You may feel, hey, it's a dunya thing, man. It's banging it or not banging it. The door is still there. It's not damaged. But you see, it's these small things that become pebbles in the shoes and create a lot of irritation in the marriage. So as far as possible, try and accommodate the temperament and the preferences of your spouse. And it will help you to mitigate. It will also help you to manage a lot of the conflict. If after all of this, you try conforming to the character of your spouse, you let a lot of the small things slide, you try constructive engagement, if there are still issues which are huge and you're finding it difficult now to resolve it, then you go for outside help. But even if you go for outside help, it's important who you select. So sometimes the wife will say, okay, let me go to my father because he's my closest relative. But then your father may be one of those people with a temper. He's not the most calm person, especially when it comes to his daughter. So Mohammed, so many times, husband and wife had an issue. Then later on the marriage breaks down. And when people try to reconcile them, they say, what was the issue? But the original issue is no longer the issue. Both parties got the wrong people involved, and then those people started mudslinging your son like that, your daughter like that, you like that. And now so much was said that it's difficult now to patch it up. So it's the marriage is not breaking over the issue. The marriage is breaking up now over what was said by the wrong parties getting involved. So if your father is a temperamental person, or if your brother is a skopskit and donner kind of person that he wants to just be aggressive, then that's not the right person to call. You don't talk to people who can't keep confidentiality. So you must choose very carefully, whether it's from within your family or even the scholar or counselor, those people who are mature, who are sober, who have the necessary knowledge, who will help you, will be able to assist you to reconcile. You see, the big problem again is intention. Many times husband and wife have already decided, I'm right, he's wrong. Now they go for mediation and arbitration to the ulama or to ulama bodies. They don't really want to reconcile. That's why Allah says, if you really want to reconcile, then Allah will make it possible for you. But now you've already decided, no, it's over. But you want to use the alim to say it was the other party's fault. Or you're just using the mediation to try and win the day. You don't really want to go in there to say, well, look, I keep an open mind. If I'm wrong and if I have to improve, then so be it. That's when you go in with sincerity that, okay, I have a particular perspective, but I'm involved. So maybe my perspective is somewhat clouded. Let me hear from somebody else. Let somebody else come and give us a perspective, hear both sides of the story. So when you go for outside help, when you confide in someone, make sure you confide in the right type of person. Imagine one spouse goes and confides in somebody and then everybody in the community knows about your personal affairs. It's embarrassing for your spouse and it's embarrassing for you as well. So those are a few aspects that we need to keep in mind. Again, dua will come in here, Muhammad. If you're having a conflict in marriage, whatever the conflict may be, turn to Allah before. Turn to Allah. When you're sitting down as husband and wife to talk about it, first make dua together. That Allah help us, Allah guide us, Allah steer us in the right direction. Be respectful. Don't avoid generalizations. You never do anything for me. So you have that proverbial example of that lady. They say she was pointing at her husband, your whole life you bought me nothing. But on that finger was the wedding ring that he bought, and on that arm was the bangles that he bought, and the cloth covering her, that arm that she was pointing with was the clothing that he bought. So you always, avoid those generalizations because that person then becomes defensive. And what? I never. And now you digress, and he starts listing all the things. No, that doesn't count. So you wanted to discuss this issue, and you went totally down a different direction. So you need to know exactly what you are going to discuss. Also, find the positive in the moment. Remind each other about the positives. Okay, if the husband wants to tell the wife, I think you're spending a bit too much, I'm struggling. But then say, okay, on this aspect, I feel you're spending a bit too much, but I do notice that when it comes to the kitchen, you're very moderate, you're very frugal. When it comes to this, maybe just on clothing, I feel you need to just cut down a little bit. So you don't make the person feel like it's all bad. You draw a nice, you draw a nice balance. And in the end, Mohammed, I think you have to be selfless. You have to be humble. If you're not going to be humble, if you're going to be proud and arrogant and self-centered, you're fighting a losing battle, because then the ego is going to triumph and the devil is going to enter. When you're humble and you're selfless and you say, look, if I have to sacrifice a little more, I'll get more reward, but also get more joy from my marriage. If there's anything worthy of sacrificing for, then it is my marriage. Then it becomes much easier to resolve conflicts.
I think it's really important once again. I think very important in all marriages is compromise, and something sometimes we forget that we need to compromise. It's a different person coming into your home, or you going into somebody else's home. And life is no two people live the same life. As you mentioned in the previous segments, even two brothers' children don't have the same lives. So if we're not going to compromise, and we need to have realistic expectations and also compromise going forward in our marriage, and also be able to resolve the issues without making a big issue out of small things.
It comes back to what I was saying early on. If you don't have tolerance, you'll never be able to compromise. Because compromise is hinged on your ability to tolerate. If I want all of this and I can only get half of that, it means I must tolerate not being able to have the other half. And it starts at a young age. When a child gets everything that they want on the turn, you're not teaching them tolerance. When there's a dispute between two children in your own home, that's the time to teach them about compromise. Okay, you want the PlayStation, you want the PlayStation. This is how we're going to compromise. You can't get all that you want and you can't get all that you want. But when you go through 20 years of your life getting everything that you want on the turn, instant gratification, then you go with that same attitude into marriage. And now you expect your spouse to do everything that you want, totally the way you want it, instantly. And there's just no concept of compromise. Compromise, it ties back to being tolerant, it ties back to be humble. Because only a humble person will compromise. An arrogant, proud person wants it all. They don't want to give an inch. And this is totally in contrary to the sunnah of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Actually, the sunnah of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam was when it came to people and offending him personally, or not fulfilling his rights personally, it was tolerance, forgiveness, accommodation. The laws of Allah, there you don't budge an inch. And today it's the opposite way around. Your wife doesn't wake up for Fajr, your husband is doing interest-based business, there you don't care. But the laws of Allah are being broken. But if your wife speaks back to you, or your husband does something that you personally don't like, then you feel I need to show my displeasure in all of its intensity. So it's more about ego than it's about what is pleasing to Allah and displeasing to Allah.
Moulana, we're going to take our last break now. To the viewers out there, stay tuned. Assalamu alaikum, welcome back. In tonight's show, we're discussing conflict management in marriage. We've discussed managing conflict, we've discussed the causes of conflict, and we've discussed resolving conflict. In this segment, we're going to touch on who's in charge of the marriage. You're going to ask every man out there, he's going to say, I'm the boss, and you're going to ask every lady out there, she's going to say, she's the boss. So in this segment, we want to touch on who's really in charge. We're going to even look at it from a cultural and a modern point of view also, because in the modern society, men and ladies are supposed to have been equal. But let's get Moulana to rather unpack this a bit more. Moulana, who's in charge in a marriage?
Yeah, so it's, this couple on the first night, the wife comes with a pair of trousers and she gives it as a gift to the husband. So the husband says, why are you gifting me a pair of trousers? Well, she says, I know at some point you're going to tell me that you wear the trousers. So I just want to remind you from the onset, I own the trousers. You may wear it, but I own it. Or I gave it to you. Look, this I think is a key point, because many times when it comes to marriage, you can get those men who would say, listen, I've heard you, but I'll make the decision based on what I want, right? And we kind of touched on this in the discussion that we had with Moulana Yusuf Ravat and Moulana Yusuf Osman also in terms of gender equality and the battle of the sexes within marriage. Yes, there's no doubt that Allah says in the Quran, and we're not apologetic about this, because what is in the Quran is sacred. الرِّجَالُ قَوَّامُونَ عَلَى النِّسَاءِ, that men are guardians over women. But you can't look at one verse in isolation. You have to look at the other verses related to it as well. وَلَهُنَّ مِثْلُ الَّذِي عَلَيْهِنَّ بِالْمَعْرُوفِ, where Allah says women have similar rights to that of men. وَعَاشِرُهُنَّ بِالْمَعْرُوفِ, treat your women kindly. When Nabi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam said, خياركم خياركم لنسائهم. The best of you are those who are the best to their women, and I'm the best to my women folk. Now, if you look at all of that collectively, of course, for functionality, like in the country, you need one president, right? And a president will have a rank over a vice president, will have a rank over a minister. But as citizens of the country, they're all equal. As humans, they're all equal. So as servants of Allah, we're all equal. Now, part of kind treatment to women and part of being good to women is that the relationship of marriage must not be a competition. I'm the boss, you're the boss. Of course, ultimately, the final decision will rest with the husband according to the Islamic system. But the husband is exhorted that treat your wife kindly, meaning consult with her. Many times, give in to her preferences. Do it her way, especially in matters where it does not conflict with the Sharia. Where you genuinely feel, and it's not because of your own self-interest, but because of the broader interest of the marriage and the family, where you genuinely feel, no, you know what, we need to go contrary to what my wife is suggesting, and that's a different matter. And I think any woman out there whose husband is fair, who gives a fair hearing to the wife, to the kids, who gives a fair thought to the pros and cons and then makes a decision, then even at times when the decision is contrary to what the wife wants or what the wife opines, the wife will be more than willing to accept it because she'll know it's a fair-minded position, rather than a man who just uses it as an excuse to be a dictator. That, okay, you can say whatever you want, I'll hear you out for the sake of hearing it out, but it's going to be just my way. And like this, anything else in life. I mean, if you own a company, Mohammed, you're the boss. Right? You have a rank over everybody. Your decision is what counts. But you'll never have a happy environment within your company, and your company will never prosper if your employees feel that their say doesn't count. That you take opinion from them just for formality's sake, but in reality, you've already decided what you want to do. You listen to them and then you still go ahead and do what you want to do. But if you really give in to them, when you see that, okay, you know what, there's merit in what they're saying, sometimes if a 50-50 thing, okay, I feel this way, but we'll go with your way. Then when there comes an odd occasion where for whatever reason you feel very strongly that no, I want to do it differently to what you people are suggesting, your employees won't have an issue with that. They'll respect you for that. And the same goes in any environment, if you're a community leader, if you're a political leader. So in marriage, it has to be about love. It's about complementing each other. Sit down, work it out as far as possible, see how you can reach a unified decision where there's a bit of give and take on both sides. You see, that's why they say always that mediation is better than arbitration, because in mediation you come to a mediated settlement where both parties walk away with something. In arbitration, it's you're right and you're wrong, and that's the end of the matter. So in marriage also, as far as possible, try and come to a common position. Even though the husband has to back off on one or two things, the wife has to back on one or two things. You want to go for Umrah, she wants to go to wherever. You know, you try and work out something where both of them, you know, you go for Umrah and then you go there or something like that. I'm just using a casual example. So it's not about who's boss, really. It's just about being very mature and constructive in the way that you approach the situation.
Moulana, Jazakallah so much. We've run out of time. I think really important points put through by Moulana. And inshallah, it could help some people out there who are having problems, and also could be a lesson to those who are still going to get married, and also to those of us who are married. If we can take some of these practical advices and implement it in our lives, inshallah, we can see some kind of difference in our lives. From all of us in the team, have a wonderful evening. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
كن سموحا لخصمك ألقى خصمك أحبك بيض الله قلبك بيض الله قلبك واحتفل بالمودة وامنح الناس حبك بيض الله قلبك بيض الله قلبك جميل المساعي وامنح الناس حبك